Hey, this is Elisha Daeva. I'm an author. My new book is Wild Thing in Captivity on Travel, Trauma, and Tantra. And Before War on Marriage, Hierarchy, and Our Matriarchal Origins. And I've been doing a series of discussions with men about issues of gender roles and roles in society and the manosphere. And today I'm joined by Johnny Junco. Thank you so much for doing this with me, Johnny. And I'll let him introduce himself and a little bit about his path with regards to this space.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you for having me, Elisha. I greatly appreciate it. And a little bit about me. I am 28 years old, and I have a very interesting perspective with life, given the situations that I've kind of found myself in, if you will. And so, kind of just a brief background of who I am. I was involved extensively in the Boy Scout program when I was younger, and that had a very powerful impact in my life, along with the natural world. And as time progressed throughout my childhood, I started to have more and more of a desire to kind of dive deeper into the teachings of the natural world. And that kind of put me in all sorts of situations all around the world. I spent a few years backpacking around the world, but essentially I was studying sustainability, off-grid living, and these skills on empowerment. I believe that is kind of the most potent form of revolution that we have, given the system that we are kind of contending with now. The more power that we can individually have as a form of empowerment, the more likely we are to actually escape these systems that we speak about that we don't like. And so that was kind of the whole driving force for me, if you will. And throughout my travels, I spent time in, as I said, various places around the world where we were living off the lands. And so my perspective when it comes to the I guess you can say traditional values or things along those lines is kind of coming from a place of a unique perspective where me and those that I was living with were living firsthand off the land. And so I spent a year studying under this guy named Eustace Conway. He's like this
Oh,
crazy.
wow. Amazing.
Yeah, I did an apprenticeship program under him, and he's this crazy old mountain man, but he surely knows quite a bit. And I got the opportunity to study under him. And it was very interesting when I was there. There were men and women there. And when we first started, all of us did all the roles. It wasn't as if one individual was going to do this and one individual was going to do that, but we were very much living off the land. And so what I mean was essentially everything we ate was coming from food that we grew, food that we foraged, and then meat that we harvested ourselves or roadkill, things like that. And so it was very much living off of the land, and we were doing forestry work, and there was no power on site. Every meal we cooked was over fire. And so it took a lot of energy to live off the land. And what we started to notice was throughout that period of time, although everybody was dabbling in all the roles, we naturally kind of went into a a rhythm in sync where we felt called to do the particular jobs or roles, if you will, that people would define now as traditional. And it wasn't with intent for us to kind of go this way, but that's just how it naturally unfolded.
Hold on one second. Come in. Come in. Oh, never mind. I'll have to figure it out.
Yeah. So, anyways, that experience kind of opened my eyes to this concept of traditional roles. And I believe that because of the perspective of living in tune with nature, it kind of opened my eyes to a different way of living where societies have kind of mainly existed in this type of way. And I don't think it's coming from a place of oppression or forcing certain peoples to act or do these specific things, but essentially coming from biology, and it can be something that's exhibited throughout all of the natural world, right? This is something that all animals do. And I believe this perspective and this background with my personal life has given me a different perspective on traditional roles that maybe isn't common amongst most people.
So what would be an example of something that animals do? Like these, what would these roles be that would be applicable to animals?
Yeah, good question. So, as a bow hunter, I've spent a lot of time studying the natural world, and it can be observed throughout all animals that it is a very different situation when someone is hiking in the woods and they stumble upon the presence of a male black bear or a female black bear. It's a different situation. The same is true for deer, for bucks versus doe. The same behavior can be exhibited with the hen versus the cock. The roles, if you will, I think vary depending on the animals themselves. But essentially, the point that I'm trying to make is that throughout the animal kingdom, there is a biological difference between men and women, and that tends to be reflected upon how they show up in the natural world as well. So, typically speaking, males, and I'm hesitant to say males as the blanket statement. I prefer to look at it more as masculine energy and feminine energy. And masculine energy can be exhibited by both men and women. I think that's important distinguishing factor, if you will. I don't want it to be represented as like all men or all women, but generally speaking, those who embody masculine energy have the role in the natural world to protect and provide. And that can be exhibited through bear behavior, it can be exhibited through lion behavior, it can be exhibited through deer behavior. It's exhibited throughout nature. And the belief that humans are beyond that or separate from that is a train of thought that I don't subscribe to, because we are animals.
Thanks. So do you think that a mother bear doesn't protect and provide for her cubs?
They do, but it's coming from more of a nurturing place, is what I would say. And that's why they're different situations.
But they are protecting and providing. I mean, regardless of the place it's coming from, that is a role that all all female animals do for their young, and for each other. Like in a wolf pack, all of them hunt and all of them provide for the cubs and for each other. It's kind of a collective thing. And what I'll also say is that I think it's a really important concept in biology, this idea of sexual dimorphism, which is every species has a different level of sexual dimorphism, which is the ratio of the size and mass of the male to the female. And then in some species, the males actually have particular characteristics, like, bucks have big antlers and, like various types of weapons that they might be born with. And so in those species with high sexual dimorphism, for example, gorillas, walruses probably the most, because the male walrus is like 3 times the mass of a female walrus. And in these kind of species, you see a rigid dominance hierarchy where there's a lot of difference in what the males and females do. And the males have a alpha male hierarchy where the males fight it out, and the alpha males take most of the females. Although when we actually watch what the females do, we find that they will do clandestine matings with the so-called beta males. So, when you actually look at who fathers the young, it's not exclusively the alpha males, but they
Agreed.
sort of
Yes.
foster like they do. But there are also many species that have very low levels of sexual dimorphism, where on first glance you would have a hard time knowing the difference between a male and a female. And most old world monkeys are in this category. Gibbons are one of the great apes in this category. So with gibbons, you wouldn't be able to tell who the male or the female is. There's no dominance hierarchy. There's no real difference in male and female roles. So humans are interesting. Humans and chimpanzees are interesting because we can go either way. We're right in the middle of sexual dimorphism between gorillas on one end and gibbons and orangutans on the other. So we have lived, obviously, we have been living for the past 5,000 years in a hierarchical type society where males have much different roles. But for the majority, the evidence shows for the majority of our history, like 200,000 years of Homo sapien history, or you could say, a million years of hominid history, that wasn't how things were. There was no real difference in male and female roles. Females hunted. They made tools. The females were the cave artists. The shamans were almost always female in prehistory, in the Stone Age. So, and then in the Neolithic period, when agriculture began, females were really at the center of society, according to all the art and then the sort of anthropology that came out of that and the archaeological evidence of burial. So these roles are very fluid in humans because humans are really more determined by culture than by biology. Our culture really plays a huge role in what we end up doing, and there are cultures around the world that have played all different roles, and matrilineal cultures where the property passes from mother to daughter, the women tend to be the ones in charge of distributing the resources. And even in hunter-gatherer societies, there wasn't this idea of males providing. It's more like the males hunt, some females hunt as well, and they provide for the whole clan. It's not as though hunters provide solely for their, core families.
But in terms of war, in terms of protection, it can be exhibited basically throughout all of human history, or a large portion of it, that has mainly been a role specifically done by men. Am I wrong with that?
Well, it depends how we define history. I mean, if we're defining history as written history does somewhat correspond to patriarchy. And although that it's not only because only patriarchies had written languages, it just so happens that we can't read. We haven't found a way to decipher the scripts of egalitarian civilizations such as the Indus Valley or the Minoan civilization. So most of the written records we have, they're all from the past 5,000 years, which corresponds to the period in which patriarchy began, which is the beginning of this idea that men protected. And then we have to ask the question of protected from what? And the answer is other males. So before this situation, there was really nothing to protect from except for large wild animals, which, men obviously have greater physical strength. So there are certain roles that are more suited to men and other roles that are more suited to women. There are biological differences, but nothing predictive in a sense.
So the statement that's being made is that the role of protection, if you will, is either coming from larger animal, larger game, or specifically men. That's the claim that's being made.
What would you say that? What else is there to protect from?
Well, I would just probably say tyranny in general, that could take the shape of men or women, and it can be exhibited throughout tribal behavior. How times of war wasn't necessarily just men, but rather shortage of resources, shortage of lands. And that's something that's exhibited throughout all of the animal kingdom. I mean, animals are constantly fighting over territory, they're constantly fighting over resources. And from that, one can take that and have an understanding that war itself and violence, although it would be incredible for it to be non-existent in this world, it's very much part of nature, the natural world. And so to have a belief maybe that some people have, that we have the ability to transcend violence, that violence has a place where it could be non-existent, is humorous in my opinion, because every single meal that we eat is coming from a place of violence. And if there's a lack of understanding with that, then there's just a lack of understanding with the way that the natural world works.
I would say that violence and aggression are very distinct from predation. It's a different part of the brain that's activated when an animal attacks another animal to eat it. It's a very different part of the brain from the type of aggression that is exhibited between animals who are fighting over resources. And that most animals don't actually end up, I mean, it's extremely rare for an animal to kill another animal of the same
Correct.
species.
Yeah.
And war is particularly a human thing, and there's no evidence for war before like 5000 BC at the earliest. And I totally agree with what you said about it's related to scarcity, resource scarcity. And so so it could be argued that as resources got more scarce with the desertification that we started seeing, that is when patriarchy arose. And patriarchy is a constellation of cultural traits, including war, widespread violence, and tyranny. So before that, there's no evidence for tyranny. There's no evidence for different size houses. Everyone had the same house. Everyone had the same burial rights. So there was egalitarian societies and civilizations.
Mm.
So tyranny is specifically part of this constellation of patriarchal traits because it's a system in which might makes right, which arose beginning with an extreme trauma of climate change where resources got scarce. There was a major desertification event. And the cultures that were in proximity to this central desert from North Africa into Central Asia turned to patriarchy, and it turned towards strong male chiefs hoarding resources in the form of cattle mostly. And so pastoral lifestyles were linked to that. And they then spread this all over the world through colonization and other influences. But it's not in our biology. It's in a sort of a cultural response to scarcity, which then perpetuates itself even in times of plenty.
I hear what you're saying. I do disagree with it. And the reason why I disagree with it is because maybe I'm misunderstanding, but essentially what I'm hearing is there is a difference between aggression or violence, if you will. I'm trying to word this properly. It seems as if violence is not being attributed as violence just because it's putting food on the table versus violence for resources, which is also kind of the same concept of putting food on the table. So to make it's challenging for me because the thought is that war itself is something that's just by human design. And again, I would disagree with that. I think the animal kingdom essentially represents many forms of warfare, whether that is for resources or just because they are being kind of poked, if you will. Like you can go up and aggravate a specific animal that is a predator that has no intent to eat you, but it will kill you. And that, by my definition, would be an act of war. But to have the to make the statement as if humans are the only ones that are susceptible of that, and saying that it isn't something biological, and to say, again, maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying, maybe I'm hearing it improperly, but that it is kind of coming from the design of men, if you will, would be disheartening and disservicing to men, essentially, because I don't think that it is something that we, quote unquote, invented or created. But that's
No,
my
I hear you. I don't blame men. What I think is that we don't have any accounts of the origins of patriarchy and how that was, how that arose, whether it was imposed by men. My gut instinct is that women were a part of that as well, that it was a society-wide response to a resource scarce environment and a traumatic environment. It is a trauma response of
Mhm.
both men and women. And now that's being perpetuated by both men and women. Like, I
Okay.
don't see patriarchy as men versus women. I see patriarchy as men versus men, and women are the ball. I didn't make that up, but I like that phrase.
What do
And
you mean by the ball when you say that?
like in a like soccer, like the
Oh,
soccer, the prize, the spoils in a
I see.
sense.
I see.
And women have always upheld it throughout patriarchy, have, and mostly for their own political power,
Mhm.
especially women in the upper classes, and have chosen the victors, really chosen men, to enhance their own status and the status of their sons. And all of this is because we are all indoctrinated into this system that says that violence is glorious, and that puts competition over cooperation. I'm not saying that there isn't violence in the animal kingdom, although if we define war as um, groups that come together to kill each other over territory, that's not something that animals do. Although there there are some chimp experiments where they could get chimps to behave in what we might call war, or has been called war, specifically in a situation where humans would put a very limited stash of their favorite food, bananas, in a place where that was kind of a controlled resource, whereas in the wild they tend to forage wildly, the resources are well spread out, and they tend to share with each other. So I there is there is violence, especially in species with a lot of sexual dimorphism,
Mhm.
and that tends to be fighting between males for females, although it's very rare that they seriously injure or kill each other, although it does happen. But what I'm saying is that within this institution, this kind of system, that's taken beyond sporadic instance of violence to a kind of an institutionalized core, big part of society.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think the expansion into more of an industrialized form of warfare is absolutely not something that we should advocate for. I want to make that clear. I'm not saying go out and drop bombs and go to town in that way. It's not good. It's not good at all. But it is kind of coming from the place of just exhibiting the behaviors in the natural world. And in terms of resources, yeah, that is definitely a huge reason why violence takes place, along with actually having a meal. And then it's very interesting as well in the social structure, the social hierarchy within chimpanzees themselves. They will also take part in violence to, and this is a very interesting observation as well, to kind of minimize tyranny. It's very interesting how it works out. So you mentioned before about how it's not the alphas that are usually on the top of the social structure, if you will. It tends to be the ones that are the most competent, and the ones that are also the most competent, but also the most caring to the entire group. And so if we are to exhibit the behaviors of a chimp that is kind of on a power kick, if you will, he's just big, he doesn't care about all of them, he treats them poorly, he will be in charge for a minimal amount of time. And then what happens is actually they will overthrow him in a very violent way. They basically like shred him apart while he's alive. It's crazy. But the ones that have proven to have the most sustainable long-term stance of leadership, if you will, tend to not be those. And I think that's also a very important distinction between systems that we have. I think it's reflective as well, right? So there's a huge difference between power and competence. And the very challenging thing is to distinguish those two, because individuals, and this goes to like the line of work that I feel very passionate and called to do, because it's hard to distinguish these two. What happens is if there's an individual that has grown up in this world and they've never had a healthy, positive, masculine role model in their life, they can't distinguish between power and competence. So anyone that distinguishes these characteristics is looked at as someone that is evil, whereas it's not necessarily the case. I can look you dead in the eyes and tell you tyrants in this world absolutely exist, and it's a horrible thing. But if we can bring light to the tyrant, one must also bring light to the king or queen, which is someone who is morally straight, who is competent, who is ambitious, who is intelligent, and who does want to serve the mass. And so it's a very hard thing to distinguish, and it hurts me when there is a fear of both men and women working in a way to become stronger and more capable and empowered, because essentially it's a trauma response, as you were talking about.
That's great. I really like that distinction, and that was really well said. And I've seen a lot of instances in forager societies, hunter-gatherer societies, that there's a cultural tradition of making fun of leaders. So there's somebody who steps into a leadership role for a particular activity. This person is the best hunter, and it's a hunting party, and so they step into a leadership role. And then when they return, there's a tradition in a lot of different hunter-gatherers of making fun of that person,
Mm,
because they are really trying to, there is a tendency in human nature for tyranny and for selfishness and power over, but there is also a tendency in human nature for cooperation.
mm,
And so those two things are operating in us, and it's up to a particular culture which one is rewarded. So
mm,
there's a culture in that Margaret Mead observed. I saw a video of this culture in Oceania, the Pacific island cultures, which were had sort of evaded patriarchy until the European colonization. And there was a little boy who grabbed the swing when it wasn't his turn,
mm,
out of selfishness. And the other kids were like rolling on the ground, pointing at him and laughing, and not in an incredibly cruel way, but that because they had already been indoctrinated into a culture of cooperation and sharing, that just struck them as absurd. And you could imagine that this boy won't do that again, because it's not culturally sanctioned. Whereas in our culture, bullies are really tolerated, by adults and other children out of a culture of fear.
mhm,
And so that allows for the tyrants to succeed. So I'm advocating for, like yourself, us, healthy leadership,
mhm,
leadership that's dependent upon merit, like
mhm.
within a
Yes.
certain scenario.
Yep.
Um, oh, and then getting back to chimps, we also need to talk about bonobos, who are a more, I think, useful role model or
Mm,
animal model for humans, because like humans and like almost no other mammals, um, they don't go into heat. So the females are more or less sexually receptive all the time, like human females. and that their butts don't turn red to indicate that they're ovulating. So, all other female mammals are only interested in mating during this heat period. So bonobos are a really important model for us because this creates obviously a completely different dynamic. And of course, in bonobos, the females are the dominant ones. They don't dominate the males, but they cooperate amongst each other to prevent male violence. And while there are some violent incidences, especially in captivity, perhaps a trauma response, but there are sporadic instances in the wild, far less than standard chimpanzees, and the males live a lot longer and healthier lives. And there's a lot less tension and aggressive tension because the females just join together if there's an incidence of violence and prevent that.
Yeah, I love that. I believe there's certain Native American tribes that have somewhat embodied that way of leadership as well. I believe, if I'm not mistaken correctly, the Iroquois. But what they would do is so you would have the elder women. Maybe you know this already, but the elder women, and within that council, they were essentially the leaders, but they would elect a specific male, if you will, to be the chief, and they chose them. So essentially, they are the one who is calling the shots, and it wasn't without their approval that the tribe was allowed to go to war or also expand or reduce their territory. And so I think that's a very interesting observation as well, because I want to make clear the standpoint I have isn't necessarily that men are the leaders. I don't think that's a healthy way to look at it. Again, I believe it's the individual who possesses the most merit and the most competence to obtain and hold that role in a responsible way. And for me, it doesn't matter who it is. If that's a woman, awesome, more power to her. And if it's a man, awesome, more power to him. The challenge that I have is when we essentially put ourselves in a situation where we are minimizing the strength of a community to try to even out a playing field that is essentially impossible to even out. I think if we just all recognize the strengths and weaknesses that both sides have, that is how we can cooperate together as one. And instead of just picking out specific variables that we find challenging with that, just taking maybe a further view back and looking at the whole picture itself. Like one way that it was described to me, the roles of masculine and feminine, you have a walled-in garden, which is paradise by definition, paradise, a walled-in garden, right? And so the role of the masculine is and again, masculine can be also a woman, someone who embodies masculine energy. We're all on the spectrum, right? Some of us are in the middle, some are far on one side or the other. But the role of the masculine, from what it's been explained to me, is the structure and the walls. And the role of the feminine is the cultivation of the beauty within that structure. And so either or, if we just have one, it's not paradise. So it takes both of them collaborating and covering each other's blind spots, if you will, to make that happen. Like you were talking about how women would essentially be counsel for the men because they have aggression. And I totally agree with that. Aggression and anger is absolutely something that's within men that we need to learn how to channel and cultivate. Like when I am challenged by a situation, my first emotion is not to cry. That is like one of the last things I do. I want to hit something. And so I've learned to take that energy and not bottle it up and then explode at a time period I don't want to explode, but rather channel it into something that's productive. And so martial arts, working out, things like that, I can take that energy and I can put it somewhere good. And With that being said, though, aggression is definitely something that men have to contend with in many ways. And so having the energy of the feminine to kind of keep that at bay is covering one of those many blind spots that the masculine has.
Yeah, I mostly agree. I think there are biological differences, and aggression. I think males have more of an edge on aggression, and that has to do with testosterone. And
Yes.
women are probably overall more nurturing, and that has to do with oxytocin and estrogen.
Yes.
Although it's a spectrum, like you said, um, so it's not like so linked to our biology in the sense that um, my go-to is probably anger. Um, I probably and I don't have any nurturance in me. Not
Mm,
completely. No, I like to if my partner is sick, I'll take care of him. I like to feed someone once in a while, but that's not a strong thing in me, which is why I opted out of having children. One of the many reasons. But and obviously men are bigger and stronger and have an edge in athleticism. And I think that's something beautiful to celebrate about the masculine. I mean, I love to see men hone their kind of athletic abilities. And I think that women have perhaps biologically an edge in verbal abilities,
yeah.
spelling, writing, learning languages, that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
So, and also that the research shows that women really excel in leadership, like at the mayoral level, as CEOs of companies. They do a really good job at not only keeping employees happy, but also ending up with the best profits. There's sort of an edge there. So I think in a post-patriarchal world where everything was balanced, we would see more women in leadership and more men in I think men are also have an edge with sort of spatial and technical tasks, stuff like plumbing and building bridges. And so I have a great deal of respect and defer to the masculine in those kind of roles. But of course, there's going to be that you could find a woman who's a better plumber than this woman is a better plumber
Absolutely.
than that man. And I
Absolutely.
feel like we should all have the opportunity to pursue what is kind of natural for us. And so I would say that a post-patriarchal world, like I do not want to see like what you were saying about trying to artificially even the playing field. Like I'm not into DEI, um, diversity initiatives that put people into positions that they're not as qualified for. I think the
Doesn't
best
work.
qualified person, it doesn't work. It's not, especially if we're talking about, flying planes. But
Right. I mean, they've done it in Scandinavia, you know?
I'd be interested to look more into what's come out of that. And I think it will course correct because I do think that merit is the best way, to place people into roles. But what my sort of path towards evening the playing field is not through doing it through either force or artificially putting people in roles they don't belong in, but in evening it at the point where it matters, which is our earliest conditioning. So if we were to really treat boys and girls the same without this like overarching ideology of what we should be doing, like if a girl was able to if a father took interest in the girl as their plumbing assistant and from the earliest time treated them as though they were competent and taught them everything about plumbing, I think we would see a lot more competent female plumbers. And maybe not as much as men. Still, maybe there still is a biology behind it, but there is a huge influence of a culturalization that is already firmly in place by age 3 or 4. And we see that with something like there's this thing called the Scully effect, that when the
Mm,
X-Files came out and lots of young women saw this role model of Scully being a scientist, there was a huge uptick in the amount of women who went into STEM fields,
mm,
science and mathematics. And then in the Soviet Union, there was this almost an artificial attempt to even the playing fields and have women go into science, and it became 50-50. there in terms of some of those harder science fields. So we don't really know what our capabilities are, and I think everyone should discover that for themselves and you know, for their own particular orientation.
Right. So if I'm understanding correctly, the playing field, as you would say right now, isn't even, and it isn't even because of the way in which we essentially push these roles culturally. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and this is kind of a difficult thing to get over because it's self-perpetuating. These um, if you can't see yourself, so if you don't see a lot of role models in STEM fields, like a girl isn't going to think that she can see herself in that and go into those fields. So it's kind of a difficult problem of how to circumvent that cycle. If
Hmm.
there's, no role models, then how do we get, girls to do that? And so it's a difficult problem, but the only way that I can think of is what I'm doing, which is basically just providing information on the true history, our history basically of women being the inventors of civilization that invented farming, um, pottery, potentially metalworking, because it was female-centric civilizations that invented copper, metallurgy, and also like highlighting the women throughout history whose contributions have been hidden by history, because history is written by the victors, and
Yep.
there's a there's a tendency for men to feel threatened by successful women because of this ideology that men should always be the successful ones and women should be in submissive roles. Men's egos have been built up to feel like they need to be better than women in these ways, and so those things have been hidden. And then in things like, where Watson and Crick appropriated Rosalind's invention of DNA, and where women scientists have had to use men to get their papers published, so they put the man's name on it, and then their contributions are lost. So the more we're aware of the enormous number of women who've excelled in all these fields, I think the more that will just start to, and it's obviously really starting to happen over to a large degree. I mean, the amount of gains we've made in the last 2 generations are enormous, but we're starting to see a real backlash against that. And that's why I'm doing this, is that I'm really concerned with that.
I see. And I recognize that it's something you're very passionate about. And I always appreciate the individual that is giving their all in the world to make it good. And I would like to dive a little deeper on the belief structure that you have about it not being a balanced playing field right now. And the reason why I would like to dive deeper on that would be that what you're mentioning about how there might be, I mean, I would definitely agree with you in the sense that there are probably instances in history that have kind of been muddled or rewritten, if you will, because of an individual that wants that claim to fame. I would say that isn't only subjective to just women. I would say it also has happened in the past, man to man. And maybe there is something along the lines of it predominantly being a male form of behavior. I wouldn't make that claim. I wouldn't make the claim against it. I don't have any information for either case. But the way that I perceive our world right now is that the structure that we have isn't set up in a way where it's unfair between men and women. The way that I see it is that there are definitely asymmetrical forms of oppression for both men and women. And if we want to kind of cherry pick the ways that one side is in oppression, it's very easy to get the perspective that group in and of itself is oppressed. But the reality is, humanity as a whole, all races, all genders, have always been oppressed. And we're in this beautiful period now where we have technology, advancement of technology, that is giving us the ability to step more and more away from that, even though we're in a period of time that is so crazy. I would argue that there's probably less tyranny in this day and age than times before, because the fact of the matter is, if we're talking about the Middle Ages, the feudal ages, things like that, essentially everyone was a slave. And when it comes to the structure of, let's take our country, for example, one can make the claim that, yeah, men were able to vote first, but it's an important distinction that it wasn't even all men that could vote first. It was a select few who had power, and a majority actually weren't. And then throughout a period of history, I think it was, so 1776 was when we actually started having the ability to, I believe it was 1780, we had the ability to vote. And then 100 years after that, all men were able to vote. And then less than 100 years after that, it was women. And so there was a difference in time, right? And if we just look at it from a human standpoint, we're like, oh, that's a lot of time. That's a century or two. But in the grand scheme of history, which I'm sure you can appreciate, it was moving at a very rapid rate. And so for me, the perspective that I have isn't that women have been quote unquote oppressed, but humans, men and women, have been oppressed and are still oppressed. Women still have to contend with certain challenges, as do men. I mean, the vast majority of individuals who commit suicide are men. The vast majority of individuals who are on the street are men. The vast majority of people who die from workforce are men. The vast majority of addictions are from men. So for me, it's like, okay, where exactly is this dominance and this form of oppression? I feel like it's coming from a very select few of males that are now taking this blanket statement of the representation of all males. Like if you go into a sports bar in Asheville and you see those guys that are drinking beer, watching TV, you think they're the ones that are oppressing everyone? It's like, I don't think so. I believe, at least, that it's important for us to communicate the oppression on both sides. But if we choose to have the ideology that women have always been oppressed and men have always been the oppressors, it has this tendency to paint a very dark, narrow viewpoint of history that is not only damaging and disempowering to women, but also a hell of an accusation to make to men, where men can't even, I mean, the suicide rates speak for themselves. You know, men feel a tendency to not, that they can't even be a man. They can't even do what they feel as if they are naturally designed to do. And so for me, to wrap it all up, oppression is something that has taken place on both sides and is still taking place on both sides. And maybe throughout time, we can continue to work away from that. But the train of thought that it isn't a level playing field and that men are the oppressor towards women is a train of thought that I simply don't subscribe to.
Well, neither do I.
Well, good.
I don't either. So like I said, I don't see men as the oppressors. I see patriarchy as the oppressor, and it is an institution and a way of thinking that we're indoctrinated into from an early age, and that is so ubiquitous that it's like water to a fish. And both men and women perpetuate it. In fact, in my life, probably overall more women have perpetuated patriarchy onto me personally than men.
Wow.
Because women internalize it. And men are very much oppressed by it as well, particularly what you were stating about this suicidality. I believe that the reason why men commit suicide more often, part of it is that they're more capable of that kind of violence towards themselves, whereas women have more suicide attempts. it seems like it's more of a cry for help, or they just don't quite have the follow through, the sort of physical violent follow through to actually make it happen. But I think it's mostly because patriarchy indoctrinates men into believing they shouldn't express their feelings and seek emotional support. And I think that is an enormous axis of oppression of patriarchy against men that has an enormous impact on men. And one of the reasons I'm so concerned about this new rise of the manosphere is that it is repeating those old ideas. Be tough, work out in the gym, feelings are for chicks, whole idea. And because like young boys naturally have close relationships with each other and talk about their feelings with each other. Male infants are just as emotionally sensitive, actually more sensitive than female infants. So there's nothing in our biology that makes women more emotional. And so I think this whole ideology that men need to be tough, that it's showing weakness to show emotions or to seek support and to seek close friendships with each other, to rely upon each other, is why men don't have these social support networks and they end up on the street and they end up killing themselves. So I believe that through healing these dynamics of patriarchy within ourselves, will heal this crisis of men that we are seeing. And but it would be disingenuous to suggest that women haven't gotten the shittier end of the stick for the past 5,000 years of patriarchy until like the year of my birth, basically, like when second wave feminism began. Women couldn't even get their own credit cards. They couldn't meaningfully support themselves. Basically, they were forced to be dependent on men just to survive. They couldn't really even decide whether or not to have children. They were pretty much societally forced into having children, and they couldn't, even if they were raped, if they were out of wedlock, they would, their lives would be ruined. They basically, for the past 5,000 years, they've been forced to be completely dependent on men and demonized. The amount of like hate hurled at women just for being women, which is a much different situation than the occasional, grouchy woman who hates men because of the bad experiences she's had with them. It was very different from being hated just for existing and for your basic biology. And my video, check out this video on my channel. It's called The True History of the World with the Female Half Left In. It really traces the development of patriarchy from the Bronze Age when it began. And from the Bronze Age, it got worse and worse through the Iron Age. And actually, it was the lowest point in our history was the medieval ages, like you said, where everyone was oppressed. But before the Bronze Age and the Neolithic, there's no evidence for oppression of either men or women. Everyone had similar roles based on the bone wear, the wear on their bones of what activities they were doing. And it was just with the imposition of this ideology that some people were better than others. Like you said, some men couldn't vote either. So that's all rolled into patriarchy. So this original man over woman thing then got extended to class hierarchies and racial hierarchies. And so this whole idea that some people are born better and have the rights to more stuff and more power and more respect is the core of patriarchy that we want to heal from if we believe that each person is sovereign and each person deserves to be judged on merit and not on an accident of birth.
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff in there I do agree with. And there's some things I would like to touch on as well. There was a lot that was said, so I'll try to remember where to go first.
And I'm trusting you to look at the time, by the way, since it's
6 minutes. Yeah. Okay. 6 minutes. Yeah. So in terms of the new push, if you will, for men, or I shouldn't say new. I mean, this is kind of a way that has this has been a form of thinking that has existed for many decades, for generations, of men kind of being tough and holding their emotions and not showing it. I think, well, first off, I agree. That is completely dangerous and harmful. There's this very wise African proverb that goes, "The boy who isn't heard burns down the village."
Mm.
The boy who isn't heard burns down the village.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially what that means is when there is emotions that are felt and there isn't a place to release them, it bottles up and it explodes in ways that are absolutely destructive to the community.
Mm-hmm.
With that being said, there is a time and place for emotions to come out. And the reason why I feel that way, and actually the reason why I feel as if men or young boys exhibiting their emotions when they aren't under control is destructive, is because of this anger and aggression that we previously mentioned, where most of the time the first emotion that comes into play is rage and anger. And so I think it's an important distinction to make when the claim is to be tough or stoic, or, you know, stoic as the mountain, if you will. That's not saying that you don't show emotions. It's actually quite the contrary. That was the beauty of brotherhood back in the day, because it was a space for men to come together to express this form of emotions, these forms of emotions that are very uncomfortable and unsettling for a majority of people. Like, I personally have experienced it in previous relationships where I have been challenged by my emotions, and I wish I could be in a place to actually release what I felt. And when I would do so, not only would it make my partner feel uncomfortable, but actually I've noticed that it tends to make me less attractive in multiple situations. And so it's not saying, and that can be for whatever reasons. Maybe it's because of their preferences. Maybe it's something I believe biologically within us, you know, for people to kind of be attractive and in situations of chaos, if you will, to be level-headed. I mean, that is kind of one of the primary components of a mature leader, if you will, being able to look chaos in the eyes and not quiver. And so, you know, essentially having the level of understanding for the individual to feel these emotions and then choose to release them in controlled ways that serves you and serves the community. Because I personally believe when we don't have the ability, especially men, to kind of take ownership of our emotions, the byproduct of that is school shootings and rapes and all these things. That's coming from an emotional place. Like, for example, a place of lust. I want that woman. I can't have her. I'm going to get her. This is what my emotions are telling me. It's like, no, maybe that's not right. Maybe you should have more temperance with oneself and be able to distinguish from actions that serve and actions that don't. And so that's the first thing I would like to say, is like, it's not necessarily that we're not exhibiting these emotions, but we are reflecting on them and deciding how we wish to release them, in addition to also gathering the information of, okay, why am I upset? Why am I angry? Why? Like, it's information that we can get. So that's the first thing. I think it's super important for men to have a group of brothers, me personally in particular, where you can open up to and express these emotions and know that you are safe and you will not be judged and you can release them, because the alternative of that is the boy burning the village. So that's the first thing that I would say. And I recognize that we are most likely going to agree to disagree on this topic, and that's totally fine. That's why these conversations are so important, if you will. from what I've learned in this conversation is we have way more things that we agree with than disagree with, which is beautiful. That's not originally what I was expecting. So, I think that's awesome. But, in conclusion, I am still not under the train of thought that women have gotten, quote unquote, the shittier end of the stick in terms of oppression. Again, just because of the shitty things that have happened to men. I mean, men have been, like women have no shortage of horrible things that have happened to them, but men have also had very, very nasty things in forms of torture and ridicule. And I just believe that all in all, the world is a place of both darkness and light, and it's up to the individual and the moral compass of that individual to choose what side to fight for, And me personally, I believe that having the train of thought that women have been more oppressed than men, and again, you're not saying that men are the ones who are the oppressors, but that's not what a majority of people are saying who believe this train of thought. They intentionally, or not intentionally, they believe personally that it is men who are doing the oppressing. It is this train of thought that is, in my opinion, intentionally destroying the family unit to weaken our culture, to make us more subjective to whatever ideology the real people at top want to implement, because it's coming from a place of division. Doesn't matter if it's men or women. They want to divide religion, they want to divide race, they want to divide gender, they want to divide it all because it's the oldest trick in the book. Everybody knows it. Divide and conquer, and that is what they're trying to do. And so this ideology to me is one of those plays in the playbook.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more, and I'm really so grateful for you for doing this work of having men's groups where men can express their emotions. And it's a whole nother conversation around what are healthy ways to express unhealthy emotion, or not unhealthy emotions, but destructive emotions. What's the best way to do that? I believe we should be taught that from the earliest age.
Agreed.
Instead of being taught the Pythagorean theorem or whatever, or in addition to. But so it's really important. And I think that anyone who doubts that women haven't had far less opportunities and far less freedom and far more abuse should read historical fiction with main female characters. Like throughout Victorian ages, I mean, women have literally not been able to have careers, write books, be scientists, be leaders, choose whether or not to have kids, walk alone in the world, travel alone, have had to wear very restrictive clothing. And there's been an ideology of even before the Eve thing, blaming Eve for everything. Women are evil. Women aren't allowed to have sex with who they want to have sex with, in ways that men have been able to. So I highly recommend to anyone who's interested to read my book and to read historical fiction, because right now in this era, although that's really shifting now with the re-rise of the manosphere, and none of the manosphere stuff is new. It's just the old patriarchal stuff that's rising again. And I think out of a response to, like you said, the people who are painting men as the oppressors, I think that's a very unfortunate whole thing to be saying, because, and I've been speaking out against it for like 8 years, saying like, if you go down this route, we're really going to be seeing a massive backlash against women's choices. And that's what's happening. And so I've been upset about it this whole time. And I think it's actually, it's not feminism. Feminism is about equal opportunities. It's actually wokeism, which is completely about creating an oppressed victim mentality. And I don't think that's useful at all. I'm about like looking at the societal ideology and not pointing fingers, because we're all born into this whole way of thinking, and we're all born into the identities that we're born into, and that comes with a certain type of indoctrination. That's just what culture does. And so it's not about, and so I think that whole way of thinking has done a lot of harm. And while we can't ever completely know like what those in power are doing and their motivations behind it, I'm open to the idea, and I've seen evidence for the idea that the powers that be have encouraged some types of feminism, and whether it's for having two taxable households could be one agenda. They usually have a lot of different agendas. I totally agree with the divine conquer agenda, and that's why my message is about unity for men and women standing together to heal from these things, in by understanding the systems and the ways of thinking, and that we can find kind of more confidence in ourselves and a lot less neuroses with these kind of like gender specific neuroses that are imposed on us.
Mm-hmm.
Now I forgot. Oh, my concern, and I've seen this in all of these kind of like culture battles, is that the fact that something has been imposed by the nefarious powers that be in three-letter agencies or whatever we want to call them is giving people an excuse to just throw out the entire thing.
Agreed.
So
Yes. Yes.
so we need to like stick with what made sense about it, and instead of going like, okay, well, it's all imposed by the Illuminati, and therefore like feminism is bunk, and we should go back to like women not having jobs and men having all the jobs.
Right. Yeah, well said. And, ultimately, I feel like you and I share the same mission, and I'm very grateful for that. And it seems like we just have different flavors of that mission, and hey, that's fine. The signs of a healthy forest is biodiversity. And so if we're looking to the forest and everyone's a deer or everyone is a hawk, then it's not a healthy forest. And so the beauty of community is being able to work together despite the differences. That's what makes us more resilient in the end. And so with that being said, I want to thank you so much for allowing me to be on your show and to speak. And I am actually very surprised by the level of similarity we have in terms of our viewpoints. And it's quite refreshing. So thank you for allowing me to be on.
Thank you. It was such a good conversation, and I really appreciate your time. And I feel like these kinds of discussions are really important. So I appreciate you so much, and you're very articulate, and I enjoyed it a lot.
Me too.
Take care.
Me too. Have a great
Hope
day.
to see you someday. Bye.